Welcome to China's Living Legends.
欢迎来到我的频道。
Imagine a massive, powerful empire. Its armies, feared across the known world. Its economy growing, fueled by advanced farming, complex trade. It controls huge territories.
Right.
Seemingly at its absolute peak, historically strong. And then, poof. Without some huge foreign invasion, it just crumbles.
Yeah.
Collapses from the inside out.
It really is the ultimate historical paradox, isn't it? And maybe one of the most terrifying case studies in just systemic failure you can find.
Right.
Most nations, they perish because they get old, they get weak, maybe they're conquered by someone stronger. Think about the Western Roman Empire, that sort of slow, painful decline.
Yeah, it's a classic story.
But what happens when an empire dies at, age 30? When it's vigorous, wealthy, still looks dominant from the outside.
That's the puzzle. That's the core thing we're diving into today. This spectacular, honestly counterintuitive collapse of the Han Dynasty. And we're going to ignore the usual noise, the court gossip, the emperors who weren't up to snuff,
Yeah.
the minor border fights.
Right, the distraction.
Our mission here is to really dissect the structural failure, the super cancer, as you called it, that just devoured this empire from within.
Exactly.
We want to reveal how fiscal policy, how local strongmen turned the most powerful state on the continent into, well, an empty shell.
We absolutely have to look past that superficial drama, but focus on the cold, hard, almost mathematical mechanism of destruction.
Yeah.
Because the true source of the collapse, the real engine, was the rise of this integrated, powerful class, landlords, local tyrants, who basically weaponized the state's own systems, especially its tax policy, against the very foundation of the state itself.
Okay, let's start with a quote. It's from the philosopher, historian Wang Fuji, and it should really give anyone thinking about governance pause.
Which one is that?
He said, "Nations usually perish due to weakness, but only the Han perished in its strength."
Ah, yes. That quote is absolutely critical because it just immediately forces you to discard the standard, decline narrative.
No.
When Rome fell, it was largely, centuries of external pressures,
Yeah.
right? Compounded by internal politics, economic stagnation. They were literally pushed over by Germanic tribes breaking through a weakened perimeter.
The barbarians at the gates.
Right. But the Han Dynasty, fundamentally different. They weren't conquered. They disintegrated internally. They consumed themselves.
That distinction is huge. It implies the core operating system, the state itself, failed.
Yeah.
Even while the visible signs of power, the size, the army's reputation, they seemed intact, masking this internal rot.
It's like finding out a, perfectly fit marathon runner suddenly suffers catastrophic organ failure because their body just stopped absorbing nutrients, started attacking its own cells. It's that kind of internal backdown.
It's terrifying.
Precisely. And having that historical clarity, it lets us quickly set aside the three commonly cited causes, the ones that are ultimately insufficient.
The usual suspect.
Yeah. We acknowledge the political instability. Incompetent emperors, sure. The power grabs by imperial consorts and their families, yep, that happened. Even the famous peasant uprising, the Huangjin, the Yellow Turban Rebellion.
Right, we hear about the yellow turbans all the time.
We do. But we're not saying these things didn't happen. We're just reframing them. They're symptoms. They're not the critical disease itself.
Okay.
They were the visible failures that basically signaled the underlying structural breakdown had already gone critical.
So, the fever breaking after the infection has already taken hold.
Exactly. And that reframing, it's most necessary when we talk about the Yellow Turban Rebellion.
Okay.
We often hear that this massive uprising of landless refugees brought the dynasty down. And look, yes, those desperate, displaced people, they were a devastating force, no question.
A huge factor, you can't deny it.
Right.
But like you said, they were only one side of a very sharp coin.
Right. If you have a massive refugee crisis, tens of thousands, then millions of displaced, starving, landless people forming armies, you have to ask the basic question.
Who's creating them? Or what is creating them?
Exactly. The Huangjin were the effect. They weren't the primary underlying cause.
So what was?
The cause, the systemic destructive force, was the very group creating the refugees, the powerful landlords and local tyrants.
Ah.
These were the cancer cells. They systematically hollowed out the state's revenue, its political control, long before the peasants picked up pitchforks.
Let's define this group clearly then, because it wasn't just like the rich people. It was something new, something integrated and scary.
It was. We're talking about a massive politically and economically unified elite, a real concentration. This group included princes, nobles, high-ranking officials, ministers, governors.
Establishment.
Yeah, and imperial in-laws, very important. But also, crucially, these highly placed, often slave-owning merchants who had successfully bought their way into the landowning gentry.
Wow, so they merged different kinds of power.
Completely. So if you're trying to get your head around it with a modern analogy, it's tough, but you almost have to combine several untouchable figures into one.
Okay, try me.
You're talking about a group that holds the kind of land ownership you'd see in a medieval feudal lord, right?
You're right.
Totally self-sufficient on their private estate.
You're right, the manor.
Plus, they have the political immunity, the influence of the highest cabinet ministers, maybe judges, untouchable legally.
Okay.
And then add the raw liquid wealth, the market manipulation ability of a modern industrial tycoon or, an oil baron.
So land, political power, and massive cash and market control.
Oh.
All in one package.
It was a hybrid monster, really unique in the Han's history. They owned staggering amounts of land, wielded privileges that got them out of most state taxes.
Ah, the tax angle again?
Always. And they held the political power to just veto or neutralize any official policies that might hurt their bottom line.
Of course.
And critically, they also maintained their own private armies, recruited right from their manors, often better paid, better equipped than the actual imperial forces.
They weren't just the elite. They were, as you put it, warlords in waiting.
That's it. They had achieved functional independence from the state and their rise. It was a direct, almost accidental consequence of the state's own attempts at, believe it or not, efficiency.
Okay, that's wild. Which brings us straight into the economic foundation they built this power on, this fiscal disaster. This is where it gets really fascinating and kind of infuriating. How did the central government, which you'd think wanted to strengthen the empire, inadvertently just hand the keys to the whole economy over to these local guys?
Right.
You're saying the root cause goes way back to an early Han fiscal decision, shifting to poll taxes.
Yeah, we have to understand the bind the early Han were in. They inherit this huge, newly unified territory. Now, to accurately tax land across that vast space, you need a massive decentralized bureaucracy, people who can survey, measure, track every single plot.
That sounds expensive and complicated.
Extremely. That level of administrative competence, it just didn't exist yet, or it was way too expensive to set up and maintain over those distances.
Okay, so they took a shortcut.
Basically. They opted for administrative convenience. Instead of taxing the land hard to measure, they taxed the people. Poll taxes, heads, easy to count.
Simple, low overhead.
Yep.
Seems logical.
Simple, yes, but catastrophic in its unintended consequence, because the state was mostly collecting revenue by counting heads.
They didn't focus on land tax.
Exactly. They let the land tax rate drop to almost nothing. Officially, sometimes it was only 1/30th of the output. But in practice, for the powerful, the privileged classes, often waived entirely. Zero.
Okay, here it is. The crucial insight. If you eliminate or drastically minimize the tax on land, the main store of wealth in a farming society, what have you just created?
The perfect risk-free asset. The holding cost for owning land, basically zero.
Which creates this massive, irresistible incentive for
wealth consolidation. For the wealthy officials, the gentry, the merchants, the ones who already had liquid capital land, became this incredible investment. It guaranteed output, needed minimal upkeep, and crucially, had zero tax risk.
So they just started buying.
They poured their money into buying up huge tracts. And it wasn't always friendly buying either. They often exploited smallholders through debt or use outright political coercion to just seize their farms.
And this wasn't just like a free market thing. This was state-tolerated, state-induced even.
Totally state-induced. Yep. The powerful elite used their political privileges not just to buy the land, but also to hide how much they actually owned, dodging even the tiny remaining taxes.
Wow.
Let's try to visualize this. A modern context might help. Imagine if, say, the U.S. government suddenly just abolished all property taxes.
All of them. Federal, state, local, gone.
Gone. For good. Now, that's a massive sudden windfall for anyone holding real estate.
Huge. Especially the big players.
Exactly. But wait. To compensate for that lost revenue, the government institutes a flat, mandatory, let's call it a $5,000 survival fee.
A fee?
Yeah. Every single citizen, doesn't matter how rich or poor you are, what your income is, you owe $5,000 a year just for existing.
Okay, I see where this is going.
The hyper-wealthy, our Han gentry equivalent, they'd instantly consolidate all the stable real estate. $5,000. Trivial to them. But the land, now generating wealth completely tax-free.
Meanwhile, the small farmer.
The smallholder, yeah. Facing that mandatory fee they absolutely cannot afford. They're forced to sell their land, their only asset, to the wealthy elite, maybe just to pay the state's fee?
It's a system perfectly designed for maximum wealth accumulation by the powerful.
At the direct expense of the state, which gets less overall revenue, and the farmer, who loses everything.
That perfectly explains the land grab. But you mentioned a second flaw. The poll tax system created something else disastrous through the monetary fiscal system.
Yes, the monetary system aspect. Another decision made for efficiency. The Han administration decided to collect most taxes, especially those poll taxes, in currency.
Wow.
In coins, not in kind, like grain or cloth.
Okay, getting paid in cash sounds more modern, more efficient.
It seems advanced, yeah.
Yeah.
But it created this unparalleled opportunity for financial predation. It put people in a terrible double bind.
Okay, walk us through that bind. Start with the farmer.
All right. The farmer's overall tax burden is already heavy. Now, they have to pay a big chunk of it in coins. Cold, hard cash.
But farmers don't usually have a lot of cash lying around.
Exactly. Farmers are cash poor. Their wealth is in their harvest, their animals, their labor. They don't generate coins easily.
So what do they do when the tax collector comes demanding coins?
They become forced sellers. They often have to dump their harvested grain or whatever onto the local market at fire sale prices, usually right before the tax deadline when everyone else is selling too. So supply is high and prices are rock bottom.
Just to get the currency they need.
Right. And if they couldn't sell fast enough or the price was too low, they had to borrow. And guess who they borrowed from?
Let me guess. The same wealthy elite.
At exorbitant predatory interest rates, of course.
So this just crushes the farmer, forces prices down for what they produce, impoverishes them further.
Exactly. It creates this deflationary pressure on the producer. Now flip it. Look at the government side. The state has collected mountains of currency, coins, but the army can't eat coins.
Right. Soldiers need food.
And infrastructure projects need materials like timber or iron. The government still needs massive supplies of actual goods, grain, cloth, iron tools.
So the government, having taken everyone's cash,
Yeah.
now has to go back into the market.
They become a forced buyer. They have to re-enter the market they just sucked cash out of and buy back the very goods they need, like grain.
Okay, I see the trap. This creates a huge need for middlemen, right?
Oh, perfect middleman trap. This whole scenario practically screams for large merchants with massive liquid capital to step in.
To manage the flow.
Yeah, but here's the twist. In an economy without, modern industrial capacity or flexible production, what's the main way for these middlemen to make enormous profits?
Controlling the supply. Hoarding.
Speculation, hoarding,
Uh-huh.
high-volume, coordinated market manipulation, jacking up the prices when the government needs to buy.
And who had the liquid capital, the political cover, and the connections to run these massive speculative operations?
Our integrated elite again? Merchants colluding with powerful nobles and officials. They were perfectly positioned.
So they controlled the whole cycle.
Total control over the cash flow, over the commodity supply chain. Let's go back to that analogy, make it more Han specific. The government demands taxes in Bitcoin, right? Currency.
Okay.
The farmer sells all their corn for pennies on the dollar to the powerful landlord merchant. He's the only guy locally with a Bitcoin wallet, effectively.
Got it.
6 months later, the government needs grain. To feed the legions up on the northern border, they take their collected Bitcoin back to the market. But who controls all the stored corn?
The same landlord guy.
The same powerful landlord, who now sells the government its own grain back to them, but at grossly inflated prices, using the government's own Bitcoin.
That's just brilliant and evil.
It's a dual mechanism for blood draining. They exploit the farmer on the selling side by demanding currency they don't have, and they exploit the state on the buying side by monopolizing the commodities the state needs.
And the state effectively paid for its own collapse by setting up a tax system that only benefited the super rich.
Who are already mostly exempt from the main tax burden anyway, the land tax. It's almost perfectly designed for failure.
Okay, but if the state was getting so drained, so desperate for funds, why didn't they try to, crack down on the market manipulation?
Oh.
Or just print more money to help the farmers?
Good questions. But the lack of real institutional capacity and that deep integration of the elite made both those options basically impossible.
How so?
Well, printing more currency. Huge risk of massive inflation. That would only hurt the poor and maybe soldiers on fixed salaries even more. Who holds the real assets? The land, the grain, the landlords? Inflation doesn't hurt them as much. It might even help them consolidate more debt-ridden land.
Okay, so printing money is out. What about regulation? Price controls?
Regulation. Think about it. Who would enforce it? Any local official tasked with regulating prices or market fairness was either part of that landlord class or was put in office by the landlord class.
Ah, no unbiased enforcement mechanism left.
None. The economic cancer had already metastasized deep into the bureaucracy itself. The system couldn't police itself, so we've got the economic engine of this thing figured out, right? Zero-cost land hoarding, monopoly control over cash and goods.
Yeah, a disaster in the making.
But wealth alone, even massive wealth, doesn't automatically destroy an empire. You need political power to institutionalize that wealth, protect it, make sure it lasts for generations.
Right, you need to lock it in.
Which brings us to the political systems that basically cemented the landlord's control, made it permanent.
So how did the government's own method for picking leaders become, a weapon aimed at itself?
It was essentially baked into the law, a legal, institutionalized barrier to entry for anyone not already rich.
How did that work?
Early Han law, the system designed, ironically, to bring talent into government, it flat out stipulated that candidates for official posts had to possess huge family assets.
Huge? Like how huge?
We're talking prerequisites initially exceeding 100,000 coins. It got adjusted later, but still required significant stable wealth.
Okay, 100,000 coins. Put that in perspective for me. What does that actually mean?
It means generational wealth. Stable, landed wealth, usually. To give you a comparison, a regional governor, a very senior official, might earn an annual salary equivalent to less than 20,000 coins.
Wait, so you needed assets worth 5 times the yearly salary of a top official just to be eligible to even apply for a government job?
Pretty much, maybe even just a lower level job to start. So the pool of potential political talent, automatically restricted to the already wealthy. The doors were closed to almost everyone else.
That's not just a hurdle, that's a foundational flaw. It basically creates a constitutional oligarchy from the get-go. Access to power is tied directly to inherited or acquired wealth.
Yeah.
Forget upward mobility for ordinary folks, no matter how smart or capable they were.
Exactly. And while the early Han leaders did try initially to keep merchants and industrialists out of office, maybe they sensed the danger of purely commercial interests running the state.
A little bit of foresight there.
Perhaps. But that restriction was basically a joke. Why? Because if a merchant got wealthy enough, what could they do?
Use their cash to buy land, since land was so cheap to hold tax-wise.
Bingo. They buy land, transform themselves legally into a landlord, and presto, they meet the asset requirement, they qualify for office.
So the loophole was big enough to drive a merchant caravan through.
Absolutely. And eventually, that law restricting merchants was abolished entirely, which just formalized the integration we talked about. Money, land, and political power all merging.
Okay, let's try another modern parallel here. This sounds like writing into the Constitution today that only, say, accredited investors with a proven net worth over $1 million, or maybe people who own over 100 acres of farmland, are allowed to run for Congress.
That's a pretty good analogy. It fundamentally guarantees that the political machine will always, always prioritize protecting private wealth, protecting existing assets over things like public good or social mobility.
Because the only people in the machine are the ones benefiting from that protection.
The cycle just reinforces itself. Wealth concentrates education. Remember, education was a scarce, expensive resource in the hands of these elite families.
Right. Only the rich could afford tutors, books.
Education then provides access to the bureaucracy, to official positions. Holding office gives you the political authority to protect your family's land holdings, maybe bend some rules, facilitate those market manipulations we talked about.
And then pass that advantage down.
Generation after generation. Which brings us to this absolutely crucial concept, multi-identity integration.
Okay, what does that mean specifically?
It wasn't just that the rich influenced politics from the outside, like lobbying. It was that the rich, the political elite, the scholarly class, the people who defined morality and knowledge, and the big commercial players were literally the same people, often within the same extended family, passing this combined power down.
They weren't separate groups competing for influence. They were the influence.
Yeah. They were an unbeatable, self-perpetuating oligarchy because they controlled every single lever of social power at the same time. They weren't fighting separate battles for economic or political or cultural dominance. They had merged all the institutions into one closed system.
Okay, give me an example. Make it concrete.
We see this perfectly, almost chillingly, in the case of Zhang Yu, a senior official during the Western Han.
Zhang Yu. Okay, what about him?
Well, he wasn't just a political figure who climbed the ladder and became prime minister, the top job in the bureaucracy.
Which is already huge.
It is, but he was so much more. Zhang Yu was, simultaneously, a massive landowner who had built his family's fortune through commerce and buying up land.
Okay, rich guy, check. Top politician, check.
He was also a powerful political operator behind the scenes, and crucially, get this, he was a revered Confucian scholar, the guy who compiled and dictated the standard orthodox interpretation of the Analects.
Wait, the Analects? Like the foundational moral and political text for the entire empire?
Yeah, the very same. He literally wrote the official study guide, the version everyone had to learn.
Hold on, so this one guy holds the highest political office, controls enormous economic assets through land and trade, and also dictates the moral and philosophical framework by which every other official, every scholar is judged.
You got it.
Yeah.
He defines the law through his political power. He controls the finance through his wealth. He monopolizes the real economy through his land. And he dictates orthodoxy through his scholarship.
How do you even begin to challenge someone like that? Where's the check? Where's the balance?
There isn't one. That's the point. There's no external leverage left.
Yeah.
If the system of critique itself, the scholarly tradition, the moral framework is controlled by the very person you need to critique.
The state has been completely captured.
Totally captured. The integrated elite defined the rules of the game, they owned all the pieces on the board, and they served as the referee, judge, and jury. The state itself, the idea of public authority, just became subservient to this unified, self-serving class.
But hang on. The Han Dynasty lasted for centuries. If the system was this fundamentally rigged, this broken, how did it manage to hold together for so long before the final, implosion?
That's a fair question. Initially, in the early days, the dynasty kind of needed powerful local support to consolidate the empire after unification. Building that massive bureaucratic infrastructure we talked about, prohibitively expensive.
So they relied on local bigwigs.
To some extent, yeah. Relying on powerful local families who could administer justice locally, collect some revenue, keep order. It was maybe a necessary evil at first.
Right.
But over time, that necessary evil metastasized into the dominant parasite. The sheer inertia of tradition, plus the immense wealth that had accumulated now locked in by these political selection rules, just made this integrated group too powerful to dislodge.
Without a massive upheaval.
Without a revolution, basically. Which no emperor comfortable in the palace really wanted to risk. They kicked the can down the road until the road ran out. So, okay, we've mapped the mechanisms, right? The zero-cost land investment creating massive estates. The cash flow monopoly draining both farmers and the state. And the political integration locking this elite in power.
Yeah, the trifecta of doom.
And the combination of these things, it led directly to the complete erosion of the national foundation, both economic and political. This is where we really see that concept manifest, guobi jiafeng.
Remind us what that means.
The state weakens while families prosper.
Chilling. And it captures the really terrifying nature of this collapse because the state didn't necessarily look impoverished from the outside, right?
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier, overall economic output, farming output was actually pretty high during this period.
It was, remarkably so. The Han Dynasty saw significant technological progress, better iron farm tools, moldboard plows, more intensive farming methods, large-scale water conservancy projects, canals, irrigation.
So the total size of the economic pie was actually growing.
Yes, which is why the paradox perished in its strength is so striking and so important.
So why doesn't that growth translate into national strength, into state revenue? Where did it all go?
Because the growth was completely captured. It was concentrated and protected within the private sphere. Those advancements, the expensive new tools, the localized water systems that required investment, they were deployed almost exclusively inside the massive private manors controlled by those powerful landlords.
Ah. So the benefits of innovation, the increased yields.
Siphoned entirely into the private sector, far, far outside the reach of the imperial tax collector, locked away.
We need to really understand what these manors were. You said they weren't just big farms. They sound more like miniature autonomous states.
They absolutely were. The historical accounts, they paint a vivid picture. These places were massive. They encompassed entire self-sufficient communities. They had their own granaries, huge ones, fish ponds, workshops for tools and crafts, extensive livestock operations, pigs, chickens, cattle, everything needed to sustain themselves.
Self-contained economies.
Totally. And crucially, they were physically protected. Landlords built actual fortifications. We're talking moats, watchtowers, strong walls made of rammed earth or brick. These weren't just estates. They were military outposts as much as agricultural centers.
And inside those walls, the landlord was basically king.
Pretty much. They functioned with extra legal authority. They judged disputes among their tenants, their dependents, often using their own internal rules or codes. They completely bypassed the jurisdiction of the official, court-appointed local magistrate.
Wow.
And, as we mentioned, they maintained substantial private armies, recruited from their huge pool of tenants, maybe some slaves, landless refugees looking for protection and food, and these private forces. Often better supplied, better trained, and definitely better paid and more loyal than the central government's own troops stationed nearby.
The fiscal consequences of that are just devastating to think about. If all the empire's real productive wealth is locked up inside these fortified, effectively tax-exempt private states.
The imperial treasury runs dry. Simple as that. The state becomes fiscally anorexic. It's starving itself to death in the middle of what looks like plenty.
So the central government is broke.
The fiscal collapse became total. There are accounts of the emperor literally lacking the funds to pay the critical border troops, the guys guarding against incursions on the frontiers.
What happens then?
They mutiny, or they just desert. They abandon their posts. Meanwhile, essential public works, the big canal systems needed for transport and irrigation, the flood control projects that protected huge agricultural areas, they fall into disrepair because there's no money for maintenance.
Which probably creates more disasters, more refugees.
Exactly. It exacerbates local environmental problems, drives even more farmers off their now unprotected land, right into the arms of the big landlords looking for cheap labor for their manors. The state loses the fundamental ability to maintain infrastructure, provide relief, or even just keep basic social order.
So it's the perfect, terrible reflection of Guobi Jiafeng. The central government is crumbling, the emperor can't pay his guards, they're probably ineffective anyway. Yet 100 miles away, the local tyrant has stronger walls than the capital city and a private army that's the best fighting force in the whole province.
The wealth has gone entirely private. It's been siphoned off.
And this leads directly to the political erosion, right? It's not just about money anymore.
No, the political decay mirrors the economic decay. When these powerful landlords seized effective imperial power, not necessarily by becoming emperor, but by controlling the bureaucracy and local administration, they did more than just, check the emperor's power.
What did they do?
They converted public authority, the legitimate right to govern, to judge, to maintain common order for everyone, into private control, used purely for their own self-interest and enrichment.
Okay, but we often hear arguments, even today, about the need to decentralize power, to have checks and balances against a strong central state. What's the fundamental flaw in arguing that this powerful landlord class simply provided a necessary check on potential imperial overreach? Why wasn't it a good thing, in a way?
The flaw is that weakening the emperor in this specific context didn't empower the people or create better governance. It meant undermining the only unified mechanism for public authority that existed across the whole empire.
So it wasn't decentralization, it was.
It was privatization of governance, or maybe fragmentation is a better word. At the local level, remember, the official representative of the state, the magistrate, the governor appointed by the court, they became mere figureheads, puppets.
Often chosen by the local landlords.
Often selected from or installed by the dominant, local, powerful landlord families themselves.
So what does that mean for an ordinary person? Like a small farmer gets cheated out of his land, or his family gets attacked.
Who do they turn to for justice? The official government representative. That person is the landlord who cheated them, or his brother, or his appointee. There's no recourse.
Society just descends into a kind of local anarchy.
Anarchy that harms only the ordinary citizen. The powerful are above the law because they are the law locally.
The whole system just seized up. It became sclerotic.
Utterly. Now, of course, the threat wasn't totally invisible. People at the time, some rulers, recognized the danger. There were attempts at reform.
Like what?
Well, you see figures like Wang Mang. He actually came from one of these powerful elite families himself, interestingly. He briefly usurped the throne and tried to implement really radical fiscal measures.
Yeah, couldn't things.
State monopolies on key goods like salt and iron to recapture revenue, attempts at land redistribution, breaking up the huge estates, even slave emancipation, trying to free up labor.
Those sound revolutionary. Seriously radical for the time. Why didn't they work? Why were they not only ineffective, but actually ended up being destabilizing?
Because, fundamentally, they were often old ideas, or maybe just top-down decrees, applied to this very sophisticated, deeply embedded new cancer. They failed not necessarily because they were bad policy ideas on paper.
And because of the enforcement.
Exactly. Because the integrated elite completely controlled the crucial enforcement apparatus on the ground. Wang Mang could pass a law in the capital decreeing land redistribution. Great. But who was the local official tasked with actually going out and seizing the excess land from Marquis Zhao down the road?
Probably Marquis Zhao's nephew.
Or his son-in-law, or someone who owed him a huge favor. The law was passed, maybe, but it was immediately ignored or sabotaged or just violently resisted in the provinces. The institutional capture was so complete that the law, the emperor's decree, could not penetrate the local power structure.
It just bounced off.
Totally. Land surveys meant to figure out who owned what and maybe tax it fairly. They were falsified. Slave emancipation laws, ignored. The elites simply mobilized their private armies to protect their assets, violently suppress any official who actually tried to enforce the reforms, which of course led to more instability, more local conflict, even civil war.
It really highlights that observation by the historian Arnold Toynbee, right? That by the later part of the Han Dynasty, the Eastern Han, the whole civilization just seemed to have stopped evolving.
Yeah.
Had no new systems, no new political technology to counter this specific internal form of erosion. It was stuck.
It was a systemic lock-in, a doom loop. The powerful elite controlled all the inputs, the wealth, the political offices, even the dominant ideology, the Confucian interpretation. There was simply no space, no oxygen for genuinely radical new ideas or systems to gain any political traction.
So the final scene, the collapse. When the yellow turbans, those landless peasants, the ultimate victims of this whole predatory system, when they finally rise up and break down the gates.
They weren't attacking a strong, resilient, wealthy government capable of defending itself.
No, they found an empty shell.
That's it. The strong empire had been pronounced dead from total institutional and fiscal capture long before the peasants ever marched on the capital cities. The Han Dynasty didn't fall to foreign invaders. It self-annihilated, consumed from within by the catastrophic success of its own internally generated oligarchy. #tag outro. So, this whole deep dive into the Han Dynasty's self-destruction happening centuries ago, it offers some really clear, honestly chilling lessons about the fundamental relationship between wealth, power, and the stability of a state, even today.
Yeah, you can definitely draw some lines.
We can pull out, I think, 3 really undeniable conclusions about structural risk from this story.
Okay, let's hear them.
First, and this is a big one, prosperity among a select few, or even overall macroeconomic growth, like we saw with the Han's agriculture, it does not automatically guarantee a strong or stable state.
Right. If the wealth is just accumulating in private hands, and especially if it's tax exempt.
Exactly. If it's effectively siphoned off into private vaults, the public system, the state, will inevitably become impoverished. It'll weaken, even starve, right in the midst of what looks like national abundance.
Okay, lesson 1. Private wealth doesn't equal public strength if it's not connected. What's number 2?
Second, effective fiscal tools taxes. Basically, they aren't just mechanisms for collecting cash to pay for stuff. They are essential political instruments. They're required to convert private wealth concentration back into national strength, into public capacity.
So if the state can't effectively tax the most concentrated forms of capital,
whether that's land in the ancient world, or maybe highly financialized assets, or corporate profits hidden offshore today. If the state can't tap into that wealth, then public infrastructure, public services, they will inevitably decay, until the state simply fails to perform its most basic functions, like protecting its borders or maintaining order.
Makes sense. And the third conclusion.
Finally, and this flows directly from the Han disaster, the burden of taxation, it must be borne primarily by those who have the ability to pay.
The wealthy.
Yes. When the wealthy elite managed to manipulate the system, legally or illegally, to shift the primary tax burden onto the poor, the landless, the wage earners, You create that fatal destructive feedback loop we saw,
Taxing the poor into deeper poverty.
while simultaneously allowing the ultra-rich to establish what amount to private sovereign empires within the nation, hoarding wealth and power. It's a recipe for collapse.
The Han Dynasty really does provide this perfect, terrifying historical blueprint for how institutional capture works.
It shows exactly how seemingly minor structural policy flaws, like how you collect taxes or who's eligible for office, can be weaponized by a unified, multi-identity elite to achieve not just influence, not just control, but eventually total systemic collapse.
Okay, so that leads us to our final closing challenge for you, our listener, our learner. Imagine you could travel back in time, back to the early Han Dynasty, and you're armed with this knowledge we've just unpacked about zero-cost landholding, about the monetary tax trap, about multi-identity integration. You find yourself as a powerful, maybe ethical minister in the court?
Okay, you have some influence.
What radical new system? Something genuinely new, something beyond just trying to survey the land again or freeing some slaves. What would you implement? What could you possibly do to break that self-perpetuating cycle of the oligarchic elite?
Yeah, what specific foundational measure could possibly restore the state's fiscal health, force some of that hoarded private wealth back into the public system, and actually prevent the death of an empire that still looked strong on the outside?
That's the question. That's the puzzle we leave you to ponder.
When you really zoom out and look at the grand sweep of history, global empires, there's this one massive contradiction, right? It just screams at you.
Which one are you thinking of?
Think about Rome, okay, the Western Roman Empire. Mighty, powerful, lasts for centuries. Then it finally buckles, collapses in 476 AD.
Right, the traditional date, yeah.
And that was basically it. Done. Europe shatters. Permanently. It just dissolves, into dozens of separate kingdoms, little feudal states.
Decentralized, yeah. Constantly fighting each other.
And the central idea, the authority, the very concept of Rome as a unified power, it just never came back. Gone for good.
Mm-hmm. A definitive endpoint for that kind of unity in the West.
But then you look east. You look at the Chinese tradition. Totally different story, isn't it?
It really is. Take the Han Empire, for instance.
Yeah.
Huge, powerful, comparable to Rome in many ways.
Yeah.
And it suffers this catastrophic collapse.
Leads to centuries of division, right? Chaos.
Yeah, about 300 years.
Mm-hmm.
Fragmentation, brutal warfare. It's the period we call the Wei and Jin dynasties. Just constant turmoil.
Okay, so far, sounds a bit like Rome's aftermath. Fragmentation.
But here's the kicker. Unlike Rome, China. Well, it managed to pull itself back together, time and again, actually, throughout its history, but specifically after this period.
They reunified.
Exactly. Under the Sui dynasty and then cemented by the Tang. The imperial system, that central idea, it endured. It came back.
So that's the puzzle, isn't it? The big question we really need to tackle today. What is the fundamental difference? Why does one society fragment forever and another one manages to reunite, seemingly against all odds?
What makes that difference?
Yeah. Was it, I don't know, some kind of mystical destiny? Was it just the culture being stronger? Or maybe the geography was just easier? What was it?
Well, the classic historical debate often points to those big macro factors.
Yeah.
You have brilliant historians like Cheyenne Mu.
Right. I've heard the name.
His argument, and it's influential, is that Rome conquered outward. It absorbed all these fundamentally different cultures, languages, peoples, making it inherently brittle, like trying to glue together things that just don't fit.
Okay, makes sense. Too diverse to hold.
So when it broke, it couldn't be glued back together.
Sure.
China, on the other hand, the argument goes, was formed by forces coming together inward. It built this very strong, centralized, culturally homogenous tradition.
More of a solid core from the start.
That's the idea, making it more resilient, easier to eventually reunify. And look, that view it's insightful. There's truth to it.
Yeah.
But it also feels a bit romantic, maybe too simple.
Yeah, it does sound a bit like historical determinism, doesn't it? Like, oh, it was just meant to be. But hang on. Think about the practicalities.
Go on.
Administering a territory that vast, China is huge, especially after 300 years of warlords running their own shows, building their own power bases. How do you just glue that back together?
It's incredibly difficult.
The answer can't just be, oh, the culture was strong. That doesn't explain how you actually, make people pay taxes again, follow orders from the center.
It absolutely cannot. Culture provides context, maybe a shared identity to appeal to, but it doesn't run a state. It doesn't collect revenue or register households.
Exactly. So today, we're skipping the philosophy, right?
We are. We're diving straight into the messy stuff. The ledger books, the dusty census registers, the debates over tax policy.
We're looking at the cold, hard financial reality, what really determines survival.
That's the mission. Because the answer, we think, lies in something much grittier than culture or geography.
This deep dive is about the wealth war.
A brutal, strategic, 3-century-long battle.
But not against foreigners, not against invaders from the outside. This was a war waged by the state, or at least the forces trying to rebuild a central state.
Against its own internal elites. Against its own deep state, you could almost say.
The powerful, entrenched, unbelievably wealthy aristocratic clans.
That's the shortcut. Seriously.
Very.
If you want to understand why the Chinese Empire endured where Rome didn't, you have to understand this relentless financial struggle.
This war for control over the absolute basics: land, tax revenue, and people.
It was a fundamental fight. Public authority versus entrenched private power. And whoever won that fight determined the course of the next 1,000 years of history. It's that important.
Okay, so if we're talking about a war, we need to understand the enemy. And these aristocratic clans, they weren't just like random rich families. This was something else entirely.
Oh, absolutely. We're talking about the Shizu. And you're right, they weren't just born rich overnight. This was an evolution over centuries.
It started earlier, right? Back in the Han Dynasty.
Yeah, it traces back to the powerful local landlord class from the late Han. They were called the Haochang. These were families who had accumulated vast amounts of land, built up local influence, even had their own private militias sometimes.
And they were part of the reason the Han central government weakened in the first place.
A big part. Their growing local power seriously undermined central authority. They controlled resources, people, and weren't always, shall we say, cooperative with the imperial tax collectors. They were the seeds of fragmentation.
So these Haochang were already powerful. But then during these 300 years of chaos, the Wei and Jin period, they leveled up.
They absolutely leveled up. They evolved from being, powerful local strongmen into something far more cohesive, more sophisticated, and frankly, much more dangerous to any central authority.
This is where we get the term Shizu Munfa, the hereditary aristocratic clans.
Exactly, Shizu Munfa. This represents the ultimate consolidation of power. We're not just talking landowners anymore. These families became the absolute core of society in both the North and, especially initially, the South.
Deeply rooted.
Incredibly deep, overwhelmingly powerful, controlling, estimates suggest they controlled almost all the valuable, productive, potentially taxable resources in the empire: land, commerce, political office.
So if you wanted to do anything significant, whether it was economic or political, you had to deal with them, go through them.
Pretty much. They were the gatekeepers. They held the keys to the kingdom, often quite literally.
You described them as an octopus before. Explain that. What were the tentacles?
Right, it's a good analogy because their power wasn't just from one source. It was this integrated system, maybe 4 main tentacles, all interwoven, grabbing every vital part of the state and society.
Okay, let's break them down. Tentacle 1.
First, they were still the massive landowners, controlling agriculture, the engine of the pre-modern economy, vast estates, worked by tenants or even unfree labor, generating enormous agricultural surplus.
Okay, land. Tentacle 2.
They were also the wealthy merchants, or at least they controlled and profited massively from commerce and trade, even if they looked down on merchants socially. They financed trade routes, controlled markets, extracted tolls.
So land and commerce, what's 3?
They were the noble officials. They didn't just influence politics. They occupied almost all the high positions of power in the government bureaucracy, in the judiciary, in the military leadership.
So they ran the state machinery itself.
And finally, the 4th tentacle, maybe the most insidious one. They were the scholarly families. They controlled education.
How critical was that?
Absolutely critical. In this period, access to education, particularly classical Confucian education, was basically the only reliable path into government office. It was the ticket to power.
And the clans monopolized this.
They did. Educational resources were scarce. Books were hand-copied. Tutors were expensive. The clans established their own family schools, controlled the academies. They essentially created a closed loop.
Like controlling the Ivy League of the time.
Exactly. Take the family of Wang Shiji, the famous calligrapher during the Eastern Jin Dynasty. Their cultural prestige was immense, partly because they dominated learning and literature in their region.
So if only your family members and close allies can get the education needed for office,
then you guarantee that the next generation of high officials, the people running the ministries, judging the court cases, they're all going to be your children, your cousins, your nephews. It's a self-perpetuating system.
It's not just nepotism then, it's structural. They locked it in.
Precisely. It wasn't just favoritism, it was built into the structure of society and government. Which brings us to the political mechanism they used to solidify this control. We absolutely have to talk about the nine-rank system.
Right, the Jipin Zong Xingji. I've read about this. Wasn't it actually set up with good intentions? Like, after the Han collapse, they needed a way to find talented people for the bureaucracy?
That was the official story, yes.
Yeah.
The stated intent was meritocratic, or at least less chaotic than the late Han system. The idea was you'd have a local official, the Zongjiang.
Like a local evaluator?
Sort of.
Yeah.
A respected figure in the local province or commandery. Their job was to assess the local talent, look at their character, their abilities, and then rank them into 9 grades, from 9 lowest up to 1 highest.
And these rankings determined who got recommended for imperial government jobs.
Supposedly, yes.
Yeah.
The central government would use these rankings to make appointments. On paper, it sounds like a way to bring in capable people from the provinces, maybe bypass some of the cronyism of the capital.
It didn't work out that way.
Not even close. This system was completely, utterly subverted by the very aristocratic clans it was supposed to regulate, or at least manage.
How? How did they game it?
It was brutally simple, really. Who do you think got appointed to be the powerful local Zongzang, the evaluators themselves?
Oh, no. Don't tell me.
Yep. Members of the most powerful aristocratic clans in that region. They made sure their own family members held these crucial assessment positions.
So the gatekeepers were guarding the gate for themselves.
Exactly. There was a famous saying at the time, sums it up perfectly. The upper ranks have no poor men. The lower ranks have no powerful families. Shangpin Wuhanmin, Xiepin Wushizu.
Wow. So if you were from a top clan, your relative, the Zongzang, would give you a high rank 1, 2, or 3, guaranteeing you a top government job.
Pretty much guaranteed. And if you were a talented commoner or from a less influential family, you might get rank 7 or 8, maybe a low-level clerk position if you were lucky. But you were never getting near the levers of real power.
So the 9-rank system, designed perhaps for meritocracy, became the legal mechanism for formalizing hereditary power. It turned government jobs into essentially inherited property for the clans.
You've nailed it.
Yeah.
It was, in its way, quite brilliant, wickedly brilliant. It provided this official bureaucratic veneer, this illusion of impartial assessment, over what was essentially a massive, closed-shop crony network run by and for the aristocracy.
This is where that analogy comes in, right? The clans being like...
Yeah, it's a useful comparison for a Western audience.
Yeah.
Think of them as combining the generational, inherited political power and social prestige of Britain's old House of Lords.
Okay, got that.
But combined with the immense financial power, the commercial influence, maybe even the cultural patronage of a family like the Medicis in Renaissance Italy.
Land, money, politics, and culture, all wrapped up in one hereditary package.
It's a potent combination. Which is why, if you're looking for a modern term...
They weren't just the 1%.
No way. They were the institutional deep state. They didn't just influence the state. In many ways, they were the state, or at least the parts of it that mattered. They controlled the personnel through the 9-rank system. They dictated policy from their official positions. And crucially, they controlled the purse strings by keeping their own wealth off the books.
And this wasn't subtle, was it? The emperors knew their position was weak.
Oh, absolutely. Think about that famous political declaration during the Eastern Jin Dynasty down in the south. The Wangs and the Sima family rule the world together.
Sounds almost polite, like a partnership agreement.
It sounds polite, but the subtext is brutal. The Sima family held the imperial throne at that time. They were technically the emperors.
Okay, so they're one half of the ruling together.
Right. But the Wang clan, specifically the Longyuan clan, was the most powerful aristocratic family. They dominated the court, held the key ministries.
So the declaration wasn't saying the emperor and his most loyal subjects rule. It was saying...
It was openly stating that the imperial throne, the symbol of central state authority itself, was merely a partner, or maybe more accurately, a minority shareholder in the enterprise of ruling China.
And the Wangs, the clans, they were the majority shareholders, the true board of directors.
That's exactly the implication. The emperor didn't rule supreme. He shared power. And often, he ruled only under conditions tacitly or explicitly set by the dominant clans. They were the real power behind the throne.
And they rubbed it in, didn't they? There are stories of officials from these top clans being openly disrespectful to the emperors.
Yes, Accounts exist of high-ranking Wang clan officials, for example, refusing to perform the proper bowing rituals, or showing up late to court audiences, or even openly contradicting or mocking the emperor's decisions in front of others.
That's incredibly bold. It's psychological warfare, almost.
It absolutely is. It's a constant campaign to remind the imperial family and everyone else at court who holds the real levers of power, undermining the imperial prestige day by day.
Okay, so if the state is that compromised, if the emperor is just a minority shareholder, if the bureaucracy is locked down by hereditary clans via the 9-rank system, if their wealth is untaxed,
then reunification is impossible. Forget about conquering external rivals. You can't even assert authority over your own territory and your own supposed officials. The political system is structurally rigged against the center.
So before you can even think about unifying China, about bringing the North and South together after centuries apart,
You first have to win the war at home. You have to conquer your own aristocracy. You have to break their grip. That was the fundamental challenge. That was the test.
which leads us to the main thesis here.
Exactly. Solving the clan problem, which ultimately meant declaring war on their wealth, their land monopoly, their political control, was the absolute non-negotiable prerequisite for the empire's survival and eventual reunification. This wasn't just about tweaking policies. It required an institutional revolution. A war fought not with armies on a battlefield, but with land registers, tax codes, and census takers.
So this wealth war, this internal struggle against the clans, it wasn't just a single event. It played out over, 3 centuries?
Roughly, yeah. Across the Wei-jin and into the northern and southern dynasties period, it was the defining background conflict.
And it became the key difference, didn't it, between the regimes that formed in the north after the Han refugees fled and the regimes that tried to carry on the old traditions in the south.
Absolutely. This wasn't just North versus South militarily. It was North versus South in terms of state-building strategy, specifically vis-a-vis the aristocracy.
Yeah.
It was like a high-stakes card game played over generations.
And the surprising outcome, maybe, is that the North, often seen as rougher, more barbarian-influenced, actually won this internal war.
They did. Which is precisely why the eventual reunification came from the North.
Right.
Why Yang Jin, who founded the Sui dynasty, emerged from that northern military and political tradition.
Because the North played its cards better in this wealth war.
They played stronger cards in 3 critical rounds. The South, largely because it was founded by and with the help of the powerful southern clans, kept folding or playing weak hands.
Okay, let's deal cards. Round 1. What's the most fundamental resource in an agricultural empire?
Land. It all starts with the land.
Now, you'd think the established South would have the advantage here with its longer history of settled agriculture. But you said the North had a unique strategic edge, stemming from chaos.
Paradoxically, yes. The North had experienced decades, even centuries, of intense warfare, nomadic invasions, regime changes, mass migrations. It was brutal, but it had an unintended consequence.
Which was?
Large tracts of land, especially in the Yellow River Basin, became depopulated, abandoned, left barren. Crucially, much of this land was unclaimed or its ownership was unclear, especially land that might have previously belonged to aristocratic families who fled south or were wiped out.
So the destruction created a blank slate, an opportunity.
A massive opportunity. And the rulers of the Northern Wei dynasty, established by the Tuba-Xiang Bei people, were smart enough and, frankly, powerful enough to seize it.
This is where we get the Junqianji, the equal field system.
Yes, the Junqianji. Yeah. And we need to be clear, this wasn't just, giving everyone a little plot. This was a radical, revolutionary declaration of state sovereignty over the most fundamental asset of the empire, the land itself.
Okay, tell us how it actually worked. The name equal field sounds almost communist. Did everyone get the exact same amount?
Not exactly equal and definitely not communist in the modern sense, but it was radical state control. The core idea was the state claimed ultimate ownership of vast amounts of land, especially that abandoned or newly reclaimed land.
The state is the landlord-in-chief.
Precisely. And then the state distributed this land directly to the people, to basically everyone who registered with the state authorities. Farmers, refugees fleeing instability, even in some cases, slaves who were freed or registered separately.
So the state bypasses the aristocracy entirely. It creates a direct link. State land given to individual subjects.
That's the crucial break. It shatters the dependence of the peasantry on the aristocratic clans for access to land. Why be a tenant on a lord's manor when the state itself is offering you land directly?
Okay, but what kind of land? You mentioned 2 types. This is important, right?
Absolutely critical detail. The system distinguished between 2 main types of land grants. First, and the largest portion, was the paraphindion, literally the oral share field, or personal share field.
Personal share, what does that mean?
It means it was granted based on the number of eligible individuals in the household, typically adult males and sometimes females. But here's the revolutionary part. This land was temporary.
Temporary? How?
The state granted you the right to cultivate it during your working lifetime. But upon your death, or if you became unable to farm it, the state reclaimed that paraphindion. It reverted back to the state pool for redistribution.
Wow, so it couldn't be inherited, it couldn't be bought or sold, it couldn't accumulate within one family generation after generation.
Exactly. The state was saying, we are the ultimate owners. You are just temporary stewards, granted the right to use this resource productively for the benefit of yourself and the state. It directly attacked the core principle of the aristocratic model, which was based on large, private, hereditary estates.
A fundamental shift in the concept of land ownership. So what was the second type of land?
The second, smaller type was sankyan, the mulberry field, or sometimes land for hemp or other cash crops. This portion was inheritable.
Ah, okay. Why the difference?
Likely to encourage long-term settlement and investment. Growing mulberry trees for silk production, for instance, requires years of cultivation before it pays off. Making this land inheritable gave families an incentive to settle down, invest in these more permanent crops, and develop the local economy. But it was a much smaller part of the overall grant.
So the bulk of the land reinforced state control, while a smaller part encouraged stability. That's incredibly clever.
It was brilliant policy. It achieved multiple goals at once. Provided immediate economic relief and security to the common people, tied them directly to the state through registration and land grants, vastly increased the state's registered population and future tax base, and most importantly, structurally undermined the entire basis of hereditary aristocratic wealth and power, their permanent control over vast tracts of land.
And people responded. They left the clans to register with the state.
Massively. It triggered a huge shift in loyalty and dependence. Why rely on a local lord when the emperor is offering you 40 acres, well, the equivalent pretty much for free, just for registering?
You compared it to the U.S. Homestead Act.
Yeah, it's a decent parallel in terms of granting state land to settlers. But the equal field system was arguably far more radical, far larger in scale relative to the economy, and crucially, it was enforced compulsorily across huge territories. It wasn't just an option, it was the basis of the entire socioeconomic order in the North. It actively starved the aristocratic clans of their labor force and challenged their land claims. Soundbite. The North's equal field system was a brilliant radical declaration. Leave your master and the state will give you land.
Okay. Wow. That's a power play. So how did the South respond? The Eastern Jin Court down in Zhengkang, modern Nanjing, they must have seen this happening.
They saw it, but they were hamstrung from the start. Remember how the Eastern Jin regime was established?
Yeah, they fled south after the collapse of the Western Jin, right?
Right.
And they needed the support of the powerful southern clans already there, plus the northern clans who fled with them.
Exactly. The court was inherently weak relative to these established powerful families. The saying was, the ruler was weak and the ministers were strong. Wang yu ma gong kan xie. They owed their existence to the clans.
So launching a direct attack on the clan's landholdings like the equal field system did, that was politically impossible.
Completely impossible. They wouldn't have survived the backlash. Any attempt at meaningful land reform that threatened the core interests of the aristocracy was doomed from the start.
So what did they do instead, this mountain occupation law? The Yanshanfa.
Right. The name sounds impressive, like they're reclaiming territory. But the reality was, well, pathetic.
Pathetic how?
For years, maybe generations, the powerful southern clans have been illegally occupying vast areas of mountainside forests and wetlands. Land that technically should have been public domain or state land available for taxation or settlement.
Okay, so illegal land grabs. What did the law do about it?
It basically acknowledged the reality of this illegal occupation. It legalized it retroactively.
It legalized the theft.
Pretty much. The law said, okay, you clans can officially occupy these mountain and forest areas. It did impose some slight quantity limits, supposedly based on the rank of the official or family doing the occupying.
Limits they probably ignored anyway.
Likely, or found ways around. And the law required them to pay a small, almost token amount of tax on this newly legalized occupied land.
So the state finds massive illegal land grabs by the most powerful people in the country. And its response is to say, okay, you can keep it, just, pay us a tiny fee to make it official.
That's the cynical but probably accurate analysis. The Eastern Jin regime was far too weak politically, militarily, to actually challenge the clans and reclaim that land. They couldn't enforce their own laws against the powerful.
It's like the IRS finding billions hidden offshore by billionaires and asking them to maybe pay a small symbolic amount as like a favor.
That's a pretty good modern parallel. The Yanshan Fa was an admission of defeat. It was the state trying to save face, trying to get something, anything on the books from resources that rightfully belonged to the public or the state treasury.
So, round one conclusion.
The South lost badly. They essentially ratified the illegal privatization of state assets by the aristocracy. They conceded the foundational resource control over land because they were politically captive to the very clans they needed to regulate. The North, forced by circumstance perhaps, but acting decisively, won round one by fundamentally reasserting state ownership and control over land. Big difference.
Okay, so the North has reclaimed theoretical control over a lot of land via the equal field system. But land doesn't automatically mean money in the state coffers, right? You have to tax it or tax the people working it.
Exactly. Winning the land battle is step one. Step two is converting that control into actual, usable state revenue. This is round two, the fight over taxation capacity. Who pays, how much, and can the state actually collect it?
And the North had a clear strategy here, too. What was the goal?
It seems to have been twofold and very consistent with the equal field policy. First, keep the tax burden on the newly registered common farmers relatively light and predictable. You want to encourage them to stay registered, stay loyal, and keep farming.
Cement their loyalty to the state, not the old clans.
Right. Second goal, significantly increase the tax burden on the aristocratic clans, find ways to tap into their vast, previously hidden private wealth, and convert it into accessible state resources. Make them pay their share, finally.
How did they do this? What did the northern tax system look like?
The northern way, again, were quite systematic. They reformed the main tax structure, called the Tainzu Hudiaoji. It had different components.
Break it down for us.
Okay, so Tainzu was essentially the land tax, paid per household based on the land they received under the equal field system. But crucially, it was generally kept low.
Okay, low land tax for farmers.
Then you had the Hudiao. This was more like a household or poll tax.
Yeah.
And here's a smart adaptation. It was typically paid in kind.
In kind, meaning?
Meaning not in cash, which was often scarce in the countryside, but in goods, usually bolts of silk or hemp cloth and measures of grain.
Why was that smart?
Because it aligned perfectly with the rural agrarian economy. Farmers produced grain, and their households often spun and wove cloth. They had these goods. Asking for cloth and grain was much easier for them to comply with than demanding currency they might not possess.
So it was a fair system for the commoners. Visible, relatively easy to pay, maximized compliance.
That seems to have been the intent and the effect. It encouraged people to remain registered and contributing, building the state's resource base steadily.
Okay, so that covers the lighten the farmer burden part. What about the other side, increasing the burden on the clans?
This is where it gets really ingenious. They certainly increased the general household tax rates for wealthier aristocratic families. They are expected to pay more grain and much more cloth.
Makes sense. Progressive taxation, kind of.
Kind of. But the real surgical strike, the detail that fascinates historians, was a specific tax levied on the clans based on the number of oxen they used for plowing their large estates.
Oxen. Why tax the animals? That seems random. Why not just tax their land more heavily?
Because taxing the land accurately was still difficult, especially the vast hereditary estates. The clans still held alongside the equal field land, verifying boundaries, assessing fertility across huge areas. It's complex, and the clans would resist any intrusive survey.
Okay, so oxen were easier to count.
Much easier to count, but it's more profound than that. Think about what oxen represented in that agricultural economy.
They were draft animals, used for plowing.
Exactly. They were the essential capital goods of the era. An ox could plow far more land, far more efficiently than a human could with a hoe. Owning large teams of oxen was what allowed the aristocratic clans to cultivate their massive estates on an almost industrial scale, often using relatively little hired or tenant labor compared to the output.
So the oxen were the engines of their large-scale agricultural profits, especially the profits from land that maybe wasn't being properly taxed otherwise.
Precisely. Oxen represented agricultural machinery, the key to productivity and large surpluses. Taxing the oxen was therefore analogous too. Imagine today imposing a specific heavy tax on a modern corporation's factory robots, or its AI servers, or its automated production lines.
You're taxing the means of production itself, especially the means that generate profit with less direct labor input.
Exactly. It was a brilliant way to target the source of the aristocracy's untaxed or undertaxed wealth and profits. It was a form of wealth tax, or maybe a capital goods tax, disguised as a simple tax on livestock.
And it sidestepped the whole messy business of trying to measure every acre they owned or estimate their cash income. You just count the oxen needed to run their operations.
It was surgically precise. You could visually inspect a manor's fields and stables and get a pretty good idea of how many oxen were needed. It hit the clans where it hurt the profitability of their large-scale, capital-intensive farming.
So this seemingly obscure oxen tax, it was actually a major tool in the wealth war.
A hugely important one. It did two vital things simultaneously. One, it significantly boosted state revenue, bringing in resources. Maybe even the oxen themselves could be taken as tax that could fund the army and administration. Two, it imposed a clear financial constraint on the unchecked accumulation of wealth by the clans. They were finally being forced to contribute based on their actual productive capacity.
Okay, the North is playing chess here with its tax policy. What about the South? Were they playing checkers? Or maybe just knocking the pieces over?
Oh, maybe closer to the latter. The southern regimes, like the Eastern Jin and its successors like the Lusong, were plagued by administrative paralysis when it came to taxation.
Why? What was the problem?
Several problems. First, remember the chaos of the initial southward migration. Household registration was a mess. Large numbers of people were unregistered or their status was unclear. This made any kind of systematic land-based taxation incredibly difficult from the start.
Hard to tax land if you don't know who owns it or lives on it.
Right. But more fundamentally, even if they wanted to implement a comprehensive land survey and tax system like the North's, the southern aristocratic clans would have none of it.
They opposed it. Why?
Because they knew any accurate land verification would expose the vast extent of their own holdings, much of which was probably held tax-free or taxed at ridiculously low customary rates. They used their political dominance at court to block any serious attempts at land registration or verification.
So if you can't reliably tax the land, what's the alternative?
You try to tax the people directly. The southern regimes often resorted to levying taxes based on the number of adult males in a household, the dinko, or sometimes a general household levy.
Okay, tax the individuals. Seems simple enough.
Simple in theory, impossible in practice. Why? Because again, the clans controlled the information and the people. How could the central government possibly verify how many adult males were actually living on a powerful clan's vast estates?
They couldn't just send inspectors.
Inspectors could be bribed, threatened, or simply refused entry. More importantly, the clans maintained their own private, unofficial population registers. They simply hid thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands, of able-bodied men from the state's view.
How did they hide them?
By classifying them not as independent peasant householders liable for state tax, but as the clan's own dependents, retainers, private guests, serfs, slaves, disciples, people who worked the clan's lands or served the clan directly, but were kept completely off the official government census rolls.
So the clans had this huge pool of hidden tax-exempt labor.
Exactly. It was a massive drain on the state's potential manpower and revenue. The state needed a huge, intrusive, and costly auditing system to try and count every single person, and the weak southern courts simply couldn't afford it, nor could they enforce it against the entrenched power of the aristocracy.
They also tried taxing household assets, right? Like the North's cloth tax.
They did try variations of a household tax, sometimes levied in cloth or other goods, but again, it ran into the same wall: verification. How do you assess the assets of a powerful clan if they won't let your officials onto their property to count the looms or measure the grain stores?
The clans just obstructed any attempt at actual assessment.
Consistently. If a state cannot penetrate private property to verify basic assets and count the population, its tax system is fundamentally broken. It cannot effectively tax the wealthy and powerful.
So let's wrap up round two, the verdict.
The South failed. They couldn't touch the real wealth of the aristocracy. They couldn't impose meaningful financial burdens on the most powerful segment of society. Therefore, they couldn't convert the clan's vast private resources into reliable state revenue. The state remained starved, while private wealth flourished untaxed.
And the North.
The North. Through clever policies like taxing capital goods, the oxen found a way to bypass some of the verification problems and directly tax the source of aristocratic wealth itself. They demonstrated superior strategic thinking in overcoming aristocratic resistance and building state capacity. Round two definitely goes to the North.
All right, Round three. We've talked land and we've talked tax. What's the third crucial element for any state, especially back then?
People. Simple as that. Laborers to work the land, soldiers for the army, taxpayers to fill the treasury. After centuries of war and instability, population sheer human capital was arguably the most precious and scarce resource of all.
And just like with land and tax avoidance, the aristocratic clans were hoarding people.
Absolutely. As we just discussed with the tax situation, they hid huge numbers of people within their estates and spheres of influence. These weren't just family members. They were tenants, servants, serfs, slaves, retainers, adopted relatives, all sorts of dependents.
And these people were kept off the official state registers.
Deliberately. Because if they were registered with the state, they'd be liable for state taxes and state labor service, corvée. By keeping them unregistered, the clans essentially had a private, tax-exempt workforce, providing labor and revenue solely for the benefit of the clan.
The state is being denied its citizens its most vital resource.
Exactly. The clans were creating their own little microeconomies, their own population pools, outside of state control.
Now, we know the North's equal field system was a big draw, pulling people away from the clans by offering them land directly from the state. That was the initial magnet.
Right. That got the ball rolling. It incentivized registration. But the northern rulers knew that wasn't enough in the long run. The clans were powerful and persistent. They needed a permanent, robust enforcement mechanism to ensure the population stayed registered and couldn't be hidden away again.
They needed a way to keep counting heads accurately and continuously.
Precisely. And that mechanism was the final administrative masterstroke, arguably the most devastating blow to the clan's control over labor. It was the three-chief system, of the Sanyangji.
Okay, 3 chiefs. Sounds hierarchical. How did it work on the ground? This had to go deep into local society, right?
It went incredibly deep. It was essentially a highly organized, top-down system of grassroots administration and, frankly, surveillance. Think of it as ancient grid management.
Management, like modern policing tactics.
Similar principle. It created 3 mandatory layers of local leadership and responsibility, built on units of 5.
Okay, break it down. Layer 1.
At the most basic level, every 5 households had to appoint one neighborhood chief, Lin Zhang.
5 families, 1 chief. Got it. Layer 2.
5 neighborhoods, so 25 households were grouped together under one village chief, Li Zhang.
25 families, 1 village chief, and layer 3.
5 villages making 125 households were overseen by one district chief, Dang Zhang. And it's the 3 chiefs system.
Lin, Dang, neighborhood, village, district. What was their job? Just pass messages down?
Oh no, much more than that. Their primary responsibilities were crucial state functions performed at the hyper-local level. First, conducting the census. Door-to-door, head counts, registering births, deaths, and especially identifying any unregistered residents hiding within their block.
So direct population verification at the 5 household level.
Exactly. Second, collecting taxes. They were responsible for ensuring the households under them paid their grain and cloth taxes on time. Third, conscripting labor for state projects, corvée. They had to round up the required manpower from their assigned households.
Wow. They were essentially unpaid, frontline agents of the central state embedded directly into the community fabric.
That's a perfect description. But here's the really crucial part, the enforcement mechanism that made it work, unlike the 9-rank system which got subverted. How did the central government ensure these local chiefs actually did their jobs honestly, especially when the powerful clans might pressure them to look the other way?
Yeah, that seems like the weak point. If the chief is just a local farmer, why wouldn't he cover for his powerful neighbor, the clan leader? Bribes, threats.
The state anticipated this. They didn't rely on loyalty. They used fear and direct liability. The positions of the 3 chiefs were often compulsory. You might be forced to take the role.
Forced volunteering. Okay.
And here's the teeth. If a chief was found to have failed in their duties, if they missed registering people, if they were caught covering up census fraud, if the tax quota wasn't met from their block, the penalties were severe.
How severe?
We're talking harsh punishments.
Yeah.
Heavy fines, beatings, imprisonment, and crucially, often the chief's entire family could be held liable and punished alongside them. Collective responsibility.
Whoa. That is brutal. You mess up your census count and your whole family pays the price.
Brutal but effective. It created an incredibly strong incentive for the chiefs to be diligent and, importantly, to resist pressure from local elites like the clans. The fear of punishment for themselves and their family outweighed the fear of, or loyalty to, the local clan leader.
It essentially forces compliance through self-interest and fear of devastating personal consequences. It turns neighbors into state informants, almost.
It created an internal surveillance system where everyone was watching everyone else, overseen by chiefs who had a very strong personal stake in ensuring accuracy and compliance. It made it practically impossible for the aristocratic clans to continue hiding large numbers of dependents off the books.
The state could finally see down to the lowest level.
Yes, hidden farmers were exposed, registered, probably offered land under the equal field system, and immediately became tax-paying, corvée-providing subjects of the state. It was a massive transfer of human capital control from the private estates of the clans directly to the imperial center.
And didn't the North also just free a lot of slaves around this time, too?
They did. Several Northern Wei emperors issued edicts officially freeing large numbers of slaves and bondservants, particularly those held by the old elite. This wasn't just humanitarian, it was strategic. Every freed slave became a potential registered taxpayer and soldier for the state. It further eroded the clan's private labor pool.
So the three chiefs system combined with freeing slaves, this was the North's final blow in the war for population control.
It really was. You could call it ancient big data management. Centralized, systematic, ruthlessly enforced data collection on the state's most vital asset, its people. The state was building a new, solid foundation based on direct citizen-state relationships, cutting out the aristocratic middleman entirely.
Okay, the North builds this incredibly intrusive but effective system. What was the South doing in this crucial third round? They had something called Tudwan.
Yes, Tudwan. This was the South's main effort regarding population registration during this period.
What did it involve?
It was primarily aimed at dealing with the huge influx of people who had fled south, especially during the initial fall of the Western Gene and subsequent chaos in the north. These northern emigres often lived in temporary settlements, maintained their northern regional identities, and crucially were often exempt from local taxes and labor service obligations in the south. They were sort of displaced persons living in limbo.
So Tudwan was about settling them.
Exactly. It was a policy requiring these northern refugee populations to finally register officially in the southern districts where they had settled. Once registered under Tudwan, they lost their temporary refugee status and became regular obligated taxpayers and potential corvée laborers for the southern state.
Okay, that sounds necessary. You can't have a huge chunk of the population living tax-free indefinitely.
It was absolutely necessary for the southern regimes to try and integrate these populations and broaden their tax base. It was an attempt to increase state capacity.
But I sense a but coming.
The critical limitation is who it targeted. Tudwan focused almost exclusively on these newly arrived mobile populations from the north. It was about registering the refugees.
What didn't it do?
It never dared to touch the existing native southern population that was already hidden away within the manors and estates of the powerful southern aristocratic clans. Those dependents, retainers, and serfs remained largely invisible to the southern states' registers.
So the southern clans kept their private, hidden labor pools intact.
Largely, yes. The southern state couldn't or wouldn't implement anything like the intrusive three-chief system to penetrate the estates of its own powerful aristocracy and count the people hidden there. Tudwan only addressed the new people, not the old hidden people.
So it's like the North was forging a completely new watertight bucket designed to hold all the water, every drop.
Right.
While the South was just trying to patch the specific hole where the new arrivals, the refugees, were leaking out of the tax system, but ignoring the massive leaks already existing within the powerful clans' domains.
That's a perfect analogy. The North undertook fundamental reconstruction. South performed reactive maintenance, never addressing the core structural weakness, the power of the clans to withhold resources, both land and people, from the state.
So, round 3, conclusion. North wins again.
Decisively. The North, through the equal field and especially the three chief systems, achieved centralized control over its populace, turning hidden dependents into registered subjects. The South made efforts with Tudwan, but ultimately still relied on the goodwill or suffered the obstruction of its own aristocracy to manage local economies and populations. The state's reach simply didn't extend as far or as deep in the South.
Okay, so across these 3 crucial rounds, land ownership, taxation capacity, and population control, the verdict seems pretty clear. The North consistently outmaneuvered the South in building genuine state power relative to the aristocracy.
It really does look that way. The North, through sometimes brutal but effective statecraft, successfully reclaimed the 3 key elements needed for a strong central government: control over land as a public asset, the ability to extract revenue from wealth, even capital wealth like oxen, and direct access to and registration of the population.
And this superior state capacity built up over centuries of this wealth war, this is what gave the North the decisive edge.
It provided the foundation. When Yang Jin, a general from the Northern Zhou dynasty, which succeeded Northern Wei, usurped the throne and founded the Sui dynasty in 581 AD.
He was inheriting this stronger, more centralized northern state apparatus.
Exactly. He inherited a system where the state had already won key battles against aristocratic privilege. He had a larger registered population, a more reliable tax base, and a tradition of strong central authority that the southern regimes simply couldn't match. This gave him the resources and the power base to conquer the weak southern Qin dynasty and finally reunify China in 589.
So reunification wasn't just about brilliant generalship on Yang Jin's part. It was the culmination of this long internal restructuring in the north.
His military campaigns were essential, obviously, but they were launched from a position of profound, self-sufficient institutional strength that had been built over generations through winning these rounds of the wealth war.
But you also said this wasn't an easy or quick victory, even for the north. The clans didn't just disappear overnight.
Oh, absolutely not. It's critical to stress this. We're talking about an entrenched power structure with centuries of history, wealth, and social prestige. Winning the war over wealth, land, tax, people laid the foundation for the new empire. But winning the war over social status and political influence took much, much longer.
So the Shizu families still held power even after the equal field system and the three chief system were in place.
They certainly did. Their economic base was weakened, their ability to hide resources curtailed, and the nine-rank system was eventually abolished under the Sui. But their cultural prestige, their networks, their sheer historical weight meant they remained influential, especially in high society and certain government posts, for a long time.
They fought back using culture and lineage as weapons, even when their direct economic power was clipped.
Precisely. The truly prominent aristocratic clans, the big names, they didn't really perish as a distinct, integrated political and social force until maybe the mid-Tang dynasty, perhaps during and after the Anlushan Rebellion in the 8th century. That's centuries after the Northern Wei reforms we've been discussing.
So it was a really long, drawn-out decline.
Very long war of attrition. But, and this is the crucial point, the initial prolonged conflict, those 3 rounds of the wealth war waged primarily by the Northern emperors, laid the absolutely essential, non-negotiable groundwork.
Without those early victories.
Without the equal field system reclaiming land, without the innovative taxation hitting their wealth, without the 3 chief system registering the people, the chance for reunification under a strong central state like the Sui and Tang would likely have been lost entirely. The clans might have remained too powerful, keeping China fragmented, perhaps more like post-Roman Europe.
Which brings us right back to the start, the big comparison. Rome versus China.
Let's draw the final contrast. After the Western Roman Empire fell in 476, who won the wealth war there?
Well, there wasn't really a central state left to fight it, was there?
Exactly. The aristocratic clans of the late Roman world, the powerful senatorial families, the emerging Germanic warrior elites like the Franks, the Goths, the Vandals, they essentially won by default.
They carved up the empire.
They carved it up. They seized the land, established their own private power bases, their own kingdoms. There was no central authority capable of imposing a universal land register like the equal field system, or a comprehensive census like the 3 chief system, or a standardized tax on their wealth.
Power became fragmented, decentralized, localized with these feudal lords.
Precisely. They divided the empire among themselves, creating numerous independent, competing kingdoms where the power of the local lord, the local strongman, completely superseded any abstract notion of a central Roman state. Fragmentation became permanent because the private entities holding the land and wealth were stronger than any potential public authority.
And in China.
In China, the story played out differently, especially in the north. The emperors, often from non-Han backgrounds initially, like the Tubo Wei, won the wealth war. They successfully fought for and reclaimed those 3 key elements: land, tax revenue, people from the grip of the established aristocratic clans.
They systematically dismantled the mechanisms of aristocratic power.
Yes. They weakened or destroyed the tools the clans used, things like the 9-rank system for political control, the vast untaxed hereditary estates for economic power. And in their place, they built institutions that fostered independent, supreme imperial power, an authority that wasn't just a minority shareholder beholden to a board of aristocratic directors.
So the thesis holds.
I think it does. The Chinese Empire survived, reunified, and endured because, in that critical post-Han period, the forces representing central state authority ultimately defeated the forces of entrenched hereditary private wealth aristocratic clans. It wasn't some mystical cultural essence. It was about superior administrative strategy, financial innovation, and the political will to execute it, often ruthlessly.
Reunification wasn't destiny. It was the outcome of a brutal, centuries-long internal war over resources won by the state.
A conscious war waged by the state against oligarchy, against inherited privilege, to forge a unitary, centralized empire that could actually count its people, tax its wealth, and control its land. Breaking the power of the clans was the prerequisite for putting China back together again. Hashtag tag outro.
Wow, what an incredible deep dive. It really reframes how you think about the survival of empires, doesn't it? It wasn't just about military might against outsiders.
So much of it was about the internal battle, the ability of the state to actually govern, to impose its will, especially its financial and administrative will, on most powerful interests within its own borders. That seems to be the deciding factor time and time again.
And the tools they used in the North, they sound so bureaucratic, almost mundane. Conducting a census, assigning land temporarily, taxing oxen.
They sound mundane, but those policies, the equal field system, the three-chief system, that clever tax on capital goods, they were the actual weapons in this war. They were the innovations that fundamentally restructured society, broke the power of the old elite, and allowed a new centralized empire to rise and endure for millennia.
It really hammers home that this struggle, the tension between public authority, the state trying to act for the collective, and entrenched private wealth, powerful individuals or groups looking out for their own interests. That's completely timeless, isn't it?
Absolutely. Whether you're looking at 5th century China figuring out land reform and census taking, or you're looking at the Roman Republic struggling with senators grabbing public land, or, modern debates about progressive taxation, antitrust actions against monopolies, closing tax loopholes. Right. It's fundamentally the same dynamic.
Who controls the key resources, land, capital, information, people? And who gets to set the rules? Who pays for the public good?
Did always the same fight,
Yeah.
just in different arenas with different technologies.
So maybe a final thought to leave our listeners with.
Well, if the prerequisite for the Chinese Empire's survival and reunification was ultimately winning that brutal, centuries-long wealth war against its own internal oligarchy, if it meant systematically dismantling their control over land, labor, and political access, then what does that tell us about other historical wealth wars? Think about, say, the American Progressive Era, fighting the trusts and monopolies, or modern battles over regulating finance, taxing multinational corporations, dealing with offshore tax havens. Are these just echoes? Are they modern versions of that same fundamental conflict, the emperor versus the clans?
And maybe the more provocative question.
Who's winning that perennial 3-round battle over resources, revenue, and control today? Something for you to definitely chew on as you go about your day. If you found this discussion useful, maybe learned something new, definitely hit that subscribe button. We do these deep dives regularly, exploring valuable ideas.
We appreciate you tuning in.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.